They called it the Great Dying, a pestilence that arrived without warning like a silent, creeping shadow, and left only empty cities in its wake. Chapter 1. The Emperor's Plague. Our story begins in the year of our Lord 541, in a world that seemed on the cusp of a new golden age. The Roman Empire in the West had fallen a century earlier, but in the East, its heart was still beating with immense power and ambition. From the magnificent, glittering capital of Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian the Great ruled over what we now call the Byzantine Empire, and he dreamed of nothing less than the restoration of Rome's former glory. His armies, led by the brilliant General Belisarius, were reclaiming the lost lands of Africa and Italy. His architects were building the Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent church in all of Christendom, its great dome seeming to float above the city. Constantinople was the center of the world, a bustling metropolis of 500,000 souls. Its harbors filled with ships from every known corner of the earth, its markets overflowing with silk from China, spices from India, and, most importantly, mountains of golden grain from the fields of Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. The world was ordered. The empire was strong, and the emperor's dream seemed within his grasp. But a different kind of conqueror was already on its way, a silent passenger on the very grain ships that fed the great city. The shadow first fell upon the port of Pelusium, a sweltering, crowded gateway on the coast of Egypt. Here, the great barges were loaded with grain for their journey to the capital. And in the warm, dark holds of these ships, an ancient ecosystem was thriving. The black rat and the fleas that lived upon them. These fleas carried a microscopic passenger, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. For thousands of years, it had lived in a delicate balance with its hosts in the remote grasslands of Central Asia. But now, it had found a new, perfect highway to spread across the entire world, the trade routes of the Roman Empire. In the spring of 541, the first reports from Pelusium were of a strange and terrifying new sickness, but they were distant whispers, easily ignored in the grand capital. The grain ships continued their journey, arriving as they always did at the bustling Golden Horn harbor of Constantinople. The dock workers unloaded the grain, and with them, they unloaded the rats. The rats scurried into the warehouses, the granaries, and the crowded, narrow streets of the city. And with them came the fleas. And with the fleas came the plague. The great historian of the age, Procopius of Caesarea, watched the horror unfold with his own eyes. At first, he wrote, it was a quiet advance. A few people in the port district would develop a sudden, lingering fever. It was a fever that did not rage, but was dull and constant, draining the body of all strength. The doctors of the age, the most learned in the world, were baffled. They had no theory of germs, no understanding of contagion. They tried every remedy they knew, balancing the humors, bleeding the patient, applying poultices, but nothing worked. Then the true terrifying sign of the pestilence would appear. A great swollen growth, the size of an apple or a melon, would erupt in the groin, in the armpit, or on the neck. This was the bubo, from which we get the name bubonic plague. For some, this was the beginning of a swift end, but for others, the nightmare was only just beginning. Procopius wrote that the plague seemed to drive its victims mad. Many were overcome with a deep, comatose sleep, while others were seized by a frantic delirium. They would see phantoms and ghosts, screaming that demons were coming for them. They would run out into the streets, shouting and raving, and would throw themselves into the sea. The sickness worked with a terrifying speed. A person could be healthy and walking in the marketplace in the morning, and by evening, they could be gone. The plague did not discriminate. It struck the poor in their crowded tenements and the rich in their marble villas. And as the spring of 542 turned to summer, the quiet advance of the sickness became a deafening roar. The daily death toll, which had been in the dozens, then the hundreds, soon swelled to 5,000 people a day. And then, at its horrifying peak, 10,000 souls were perishing in the great city every single day. Constantinople, the vibrant heart of the world, ground to a halt. The markets fell silent. The workshops were abandoned. The great forums and hippodromes were empty. All of normal life ceased, replaced by a single all-consuming task, dealing with the dead. At first, the bodies were buried in the city's cemeteries, but they were filled within days. Then, the authorities dug great pits, but these too were quickly filled. Soon, there was no one left to dig the graves. The social fabric of the city completely unraveled. Bodies were left inside houses, their doors sealed, or simply abandoned in the streets. The stench of death hung over the once beautiful capital like a shroud. Justinian, in a desperate attempt to restore order, commanded that the bodies be collected and disposed of. Great piles of the dead were stacked at the waterfront to be loaded onto ships and cast into the sea. When that was not enough, the soldiers began to fill the stone towers that punctuated the city's walls with the dead, layering them like lasagna, and then sealing the roofs. And then the unthinkable happened. The plague entered the imperial palace itself. The Emperor Justinian, the master of the world, was struck down by the fever and the buboes. A wave of terror must have swept through the empire. If the emperor, God's regent on earth, could not be protected, then what hope was there for anyone? For a time, it seemed he would succumb, but through what his people saw as a divine miracle, Justinian survived. He was one of the lucky few, but his recovery did not stop the plague. It raged for 4 months in the capital before it finally began to recede, leaving a stunned, hollowed-out city in its wake. Nearly half of Constantinople's population was gone, and from the capital, the plague had spread, carried by ships and armies to every corner of the Mediterranean world, to Italy, to Persia, to Africa, to Gaul. For the next 2 centuries, it would return in waves, again and again, ensuring the population never fully recovered. It is estimated that the plague of Justinian killed between 25 and 50 million people, perhaps a quarter of the entire population of the known world. Justinian's dream of a restored Roman Empire died with them. His armies were decimated, his treasury was bankrupted, and his empire was left permanently weakened, a shadow of its former glory. The great dying had drawn a dark line across the pages of history, helping to close the chapter on the classical world and opening the door to the Dark Ages. It was the world's first great lesson in humility, a terrifying reminder that the greatest empires are not brought down by armies, but by the silent, creeping shadow that arrives without warning. Chapter 2. The Black Death. For nearly 800 years, the Great Plague seemed to have vanished from the earth. The world had changed. The Roman Empire was a distant memory, replaced by a new kind of civilization. The world of medieval Europe. It was a world of knights and castles, of soaring cathedrals and absolute faith. The continent was more crowded than ever before, its cities growing, its trade routes expanding, a complex and interconnected society that felt, for all its hardships, secure in its divinely ordered structure. But this new, bustling world was unwittingly creating the perfect conditions for the return of the ancient shadow. The story of its return begins not in Europe, but far to the east, along the great trade routes of the Silk Road. The bacterium, which had been lying dormant in populations of rodents in the vast grasslands of Asia, had found a new, aggressive host, the Mongol Empire. As the Mongol armies swept across the continent, they carried the plague with them. In the year 1346, they laid siege to the city of Kaffa, a thriving trading port on the Black Sea run by merchants from Genoa. The siege dragged on, and soon the plague began to ravage the Mongol army, killing thousands. But from this disaster, the Mongol leader devised a terrifying new strategy. What might be one of the first acts of biological warfare in history. He ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers to be loaded onto his giant catapults, and one by one, the gruesome projectiles were hurled over the city walls, raining down a pestilence upon the terrified defenders. The Genoese could not withstand the horror. They abandoned the city and fled in their trading ships, hoping to sail back to the safety of their homes in Europe. But it was too late. The plague was already aboard their ships, hidden within the fleas on the rats, and now within the sailors themselves. In October of 1347, 12 of these Genoese ships, these death ships, arrived at the port of Messina, in Sicily. The townspeople gathered at the docks to greet them, but were met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors aboard were either already dead or were gravely ill, their bodies covered in strange, dark swellings that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, in a panic, ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor. But again, it was too late. The rats had already scurried ashore. The shadow had arrived in Europe. and the people of the 14th century soon learned that this was not one single disease, but a monster with 3 terrifying faces. The most common form was the bubonic plague, the same that had struck Justinian's empire. It was carried by the fleas, and its telltale sign was the great, agonizing buboes in the groin, neck, and armpits. The second form was the pneumonic plague. This was far more dangerous, as it infected the lungs and could be spread directly from person to person through the air by a simple cough. Its arrival in a community meant the end was near. The third and most deadly form was the septicemic plague. It occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. The victim's blood would be overwhelmed, causing widespread internal bleeding. This would lead to the skin turning a dark purple, almost black, in the final hours of life. It is from this horrifying symptom that the plague received its most famous and terrifying name, the Black Death. From Sicily, the plague moved like a slow, unstoppable tidal wave of death. It spread to the great ports of Genoa and Venice, and from there, it exploded across the continent. It moved along the trade routes, carried by merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and refugees. North through France, across the Channel into England, east into Germany and Scandinavia. No place was safe. It did not matter if you were a poor farmer in a hut or a king in a castle. The world descended into a state of panic and chaos. Medieval medicine, based on theories of bad air and imbalanced humors, was utterly powerless. Doctors, dressed in their now iconic beaked masks stuffed with herbs, would visit the sick, but they could do nothing. They often caught the plague themselves and died alongside their patients. The priests, who told the people that the plague was a divine punishment from a wrathful God, also had no answers. Their prayers for deliverance went unanswered, and they too died in vast numbers, leaving entire communities without spiritual guidance. The very fabric of society began to tear apart. Fear obliterated the bonds of family and community. People abandoned their sick loved ones, parents left their children, and husbands left their wives, all in a desperate attempt to flee the pestilence. The rich fled to their isolated country estates, while the poor were trapped in the cities to die. Law and order collapsed. The world, it seemed to many, was coming to an end. In this atmosphere of terror and despair, strange and extreme movements arose. Great processions of flagellants appeared, wandering from town to town. These were men and women who, believing the plague to be God's punishment, would whip their own backs with leather cords tipped with iron until they bled, hoping that by taking on this penance, they could atone for the sins of the world and convince God to spare them. And in the darkness of their fear, people searched for someone to blame. Rumors spread that the plague was not a natural disease, but a poison that had been spread by outsiders. Across Europe, communities turned on their Jewish neighbors, accusing them of poisoning the wells. This led to horrific pogroms and massacres, a wave of human-made terror on top of the divine one. For 5 long years, from 1347 to 1352, the Black Death swept across the land. When the first great wave was over, the world was a different place. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe was gone. In some places, the death toll was far higher. The scale of the loss is almost impossible for us to comprehend. But this unimaginable catastrophe was not just an end. It was also a brutal and transformative beginning. The old rigid feudal system, which had been in place for centuries, was shattered. With so many peasants dead, labor was suddenly scarce and valuable. The survivors could demand higher wages, better conditions, and more freedom. Many left the manors they had been tied to for generations, seeking a new life in the recovering towns. The absolute authority of the church was shaken. Its inability to explain or stop the plague led many to question their faith, paving the way for new ideas and, eventually, the Reformation. The focus of art and literature shifted, becoming more concerned with the reality of death and the individual's experience of life. The Black Death was arguably the single greatest disaster in European history. It was a dark mirror that showed humanity its own fragility. But it was also a fire that, in its terrible burning, cleared away the old world. From the ashes of that devastation, a new society would eventually be born, one that would lead to the Renaissance and the slow, painful birth of the modern world. Chapter 3. The Speckled Monster. There are shadows that flash and then recede, and then there are those that are always with us, a constant and accepted part of the human condition. For at least 3,000 years, one such shadow fell upon all of humanity, from the most powerful pharaoh to the humblest farmer. It was a disease of such dreadful familiarity that it became a grim rite of passage. This was the long, terrible reign of smallpox. Its symptoms were unmistakable and deeply feared. It began, as many sicknesses do, with a fever and racking pains in the body. But then came its signature horror, the eruption of a dense, blister-like rash that would cover the entire body. These pustules would swell, merge, and form a hideous, painful crust. For those who survived, and many did not, the disease would leave its permanent mark, a constellation of deep, pitted scars, a physical reminder of their ordeal. It was a disease that could take your life, your sight, or simply your face, leaving you a stranger to yourself. Its origins are ancient, lost to the depths of time, but its calling card has been found on the mummified face of the pharaoh Ramesses V, proving it was a terror even in the age of the gods we have spoken of. For centuries, it was an endemic scourge in the crowded cities of Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was primarily a disease of children. So many were exposed to it in their youth that most of the adult population consisted of survivors who carried the scars and the priceless gift of immunity. To live to adulthood was to have already met and defeated the speckled monster. But this long, grim coexistence was confined to the old world. Across the great ocean, the continents of the Americas were a separate world entirely, their peoples shielded by isolation from the diseases that had shaped the rest of humanity for millennia. Their bodies had never learned the language of this particular sickness. They had no defenses, no ancestral memory of the enemy. They were of virgin soil, and in the late 15th century, the seeds of that enemy were about to be planted. When the first European explorers and conquistadors sailed across the Atlantic, they brought with them a hidden and unintentional cargo, far more destructive than any sword or cannon. They brought smallpox. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the arrival of this disease was not an epidemic. It was an apocalypse. The fall of the great Aztec and Inca empires is often told as a story of military conquest, of a few hundred steel-clad conquistadors toppling civilizations of millions. But the truth is far more chilling. The greatest conquistador was not Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro. It was the speckled monster. The disease moved faster than the armies, transmitted by trade, by refugees, by the very air itself. It would arrive in a thriving, densely populated city, and within months it would leave behind a ghost town. Imagine the absolute terror. A disease of unimaginable horror appears as if from nowhere, killing with a speed and efficiency that seemed like demonic magic. It killed the emperors, the priests, the warriors, and the farmers. It wiped out entire families, leaving no one to tend the crops or bury the dead. It is estimated that in the century following its arrival, as much as 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was wiped out, the vast majority of them victims of smallpox. It was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in human history, a world-breaking event that left two continents hollowed out and vulnerable. For centuries more, smallpox continued its reign as one of humanity's most feared killers. But humanity was learning. In Asia and Africa, an early form of defense had been practiced for centuries, a risky but often effective technique called variolation. It was observed that those who survived a mild case of smallpox were immune for life. And so, doctors would take matter from a pustule of a person with a mild case and intentionally introduce it into a healthy person, often through a scratch in the skin. The hope was to induce a mild, controlled infection that would grant them immunity. It was a dangerous gamble, as the resulting infection could still be severe and fatal. But it was a gamble many were willing to take against a disease so deadly. The true turning point, the moment a light finally appeared at the end of a very long, dark tunnel, came in the late 18th century with the work of an English country doctor named Edward Jenner. Jenner was a keen observer of the world around him. He had long been intrigued by the folk wisdom among the local dairy workers that the milkmaids who contracted a mild, non-lethal disease called cowpox from the cattle they tended seemed to be magically protected from the horrors of smallpox. Jenner formed a hypothesis that the cowpox infection was somehow teaching the body how to fight off its much more dangerous cousin. In 1796, he decided to test his theory in an experiment that would change the world. He took pus from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms. He then took his gardener's 8-year-old son, James Phipps, and made 2 small cuts on the boy's arm, introducing the cowpox matter. The boy developed a mild fever and a single sore, but quickly recovered. Some weeks later came the moment of terrifying truth. Jenner exposed the boy directly to smallpox matter. He waited, watching for the telltale fever, the dreaded rash, but nothing happened. The boy remained perfectly healthy. He was immune. Jenner called his new technique vaccination, from the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. It was the beginning of the end for the speckled monster. Jenner's discovery spread across the globe, and for the next 2 centuries, humanity waged a relentless, global campaign against its ancient foe. Finally, in the year 1980, the World Health Organization made a triumphant and unprecedented announcement. Smallpox had been completely eradicated from the wild. The disease that had scarred the face of pharaohs, that had hollowed out the great empires of the Americas, and that had haunted the dreams of parents for thousands of years, was gone. The speckled monster, for the first time in human history, was dead. It is a story of immense suffering and loss, but also a quiet testament to the power of observation, of science, and of a hope that even our most ancient and terrifying shadows can, one day, be banished into the light. Chapter 4. The Blue Death. In the 19th century, humanity remade the world. The Industrial Revolution had filled the cities of Europe and America with factories, railways, and a sense of unstoppable progress. Millions flocked from the countryside to these new urban centers like London, Paris, and New York, seeking work and a new life. But these cities were growing faster than sanitation could keep up. They were becoming ticking time bombs, choked with filth. Their water sources hopelessly contaminated. And from the ancient delta of the Ganges River in India, a disease perfectly suited for this new dirty world was beginning its first global conquest. This was cholera, a disease caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. For centuries, it had been a localized terror in India. But now, carried by modern trade and transport, it was spreading with a speed the world had never seen before. Its method of attack was brutally simple and terrifyingly efficient. It contaminated the water. A person would drink from a well or a river polluted with human waste, and the bacteria would enter their system. The onset was sudden and violent. A healthy person could wake up in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The first sign was not a fever or a rash, but a sudden, overwhelming, and painless diarrhea. This was not a normal sickness. The bacteria caused the victim's intestines to pour out immense quantities of fluid. It was described as rice water stool, a pale, milky liquid that would gush from the body in shocking volumes, sometimes gallons in a single day. This was quickly followed by violent, projectile vomiting. The body was emptying itself of every last drop of moisture. This catastrophic fluid loss led to the disease's most terrifying and signature feature. The victim would suffer from extreme muscle cramps as their electrolytes were depleted. Their skin would lose its elasticity, becoming cold, clammy, and wrinkled, like a washerwoman's hand. Their eyes, would sink deep into their sockets, and their cheeks would become hollow. And most chillingly, as the blood thickened from dehydration and the oxygen levels plummeted, their skin would take on a ghastly, bluish-gray tint. It was this spectral, ghost-like appearance that gave the disease its name, the Blue Death. In the final stages, the victim, though often still conscious, would be too weak to speak. Their voice a mere whisper. Their pulse would become faint, their breath shallow, until finally, their body would simply shut down. The entire process, from the first symptom to the final moment, could take less than 18 hours. When the first great cholera pandemic arrived in the cities of Europe in the 1830s, it was met with a wave of absolute terror and confusion. The doctors of the age were baffled and terrified. The dominant medical theory was the miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread by bad air, a foul-smelling vapor that rose from rotting organic matter and filth. This theory seemed to make sense. The poorest, filthiest parts of the cities were always hit the hardest. To combat this supposed miasma, cities took desperate and ultimately useless measures. They would burn giant barrels of tar in the streets, hoping the acrid smoke would purify the air. They would fire cannons and ring church bells, believing the loud noises could disrupt the poisonous vapor. Officials would order houses to be cleansed with strong-smelling substances like vinegar or chlorine, all in a futile attempt to fight a foe they could not see and did not understand. The societal collapse was as swift as the disease. As the death carts began to patrol the streets, their bells ringing, a profound paranoia gripped the public. People became afraid of each other, afraid of the very air they breathed. No one knew how it spread, so everything was a potential source of danger. Rumors ran wild, just as they had during the Black Death. Many believed it was a poison being spread by the government or the rich to cull the poor. Riots broke out in cities across Europe, with mobs attacking doctors and magistrates, convinced they were part of a conspiracy. The sheer volume of the dead was overwhelming. Coffins were in short supply, and mass graves were dug in a desperate hurry. The normal rituals of death and burial were abandoned. Families were torn apart in an instant. But it was during the Great London Outbreak of 1854 that a new kind of thinking began to emerge. A quiet, methodical English physician named John Snow had become skeptical of the miasma theory. He observed that the disease seemed to track not the air, but the water. In the Soho district of London, he began a revolutionary investigation. He went from house to house, meticulously mapping every cholera death. And his map revealed a terrifying pattern. The deaths were all clustered around a single popular public water pump on Broad Street. To prove his theory, Snow took his evidence to the local authorities and convinced them to take a radical step: to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, making it impossible to draw water from it. The authorities were skeptical, but desperate enough to try. And almost immediately, the cholera cases in that neighborhood plummeted. The outbreak in Soho was over. It was later discovered that the well beneath the pump had been contaminated by a nearby leaking cesspit, where the waste from a single baby who had died of cholera had been dumped. John Snow's work was a landmark in the history of public health. He had proven that cholera was not in the air, but in the water. He was the father of modern epidemiology. The Blue Death was a disease born of the modern world's filth, but it was also the disease that forced the modern world to clean up its act. The terror it inspired eventually led to the great sanitation movements of the late 19th century. Cities began to build massive modern sewer systems and water treatment plants, separating waste from drinking water. These monumental engineering projects, buried deep beneath our feet, are the true legacy of cholera. They are the unseen monuments built in memory of the millions who died, a silent testament to the hard-won lesson that the path to progress is paved not just with iron and steam, but with clean water. Chapter 5. The Athenian Fever. Our story now takes us back, deep into the ancient world, to the 5th century before Christ. We arrive in the city of Athens, a place that shines like a jewel in the midday sun. This is the height of its golden age. The magnificent Parthenon, a marble masterpiece dedicated to the goddess Athena, has just been completed on the Acropolis. In the bustling marketplace, the Agora, a philosopher named Socrates is teaching the youth to question everything. The world's first great plays are being performed in the Theater of Dionysus. It is the birthplace of democracy, a city brimming with confidence, art, and intellectual power. But this golden age is set against a backdrop of war. The Great Peloponnesian War has just begun between Athens and its grim rival, the military city-state of Sparta. The Athenian leader, the brilliant statesman Pericles, has devised a strategy. He has ordered all the citizens from the surrounding countryside of Attica to abandon their farms and take shelter behind the city's massive defensive fortifications, the long walls which connect Athens to its vital port, Piraeus. The city is now an impenetrable fortress, but it is also a dangerously overcrowded and unsanitary trap, waiting for a spark. In the second year of the war, 430 BC, that spark arrived. It came, as the great historian Thucydides wrote, by sea. He tells us that the disease was said to have originated deep in Africa, in Ethiopia, before making its way through Egypt and Libya. It then boarded the ships that carried trade and supplies to Athens, making its first appearance in the crowded, bustling port of Piraeus. At first, the people of the port accused their enemies, the Spartans, of poisoning their wells and cisterns. They could not imagine any other cause for such a sudden and vile sickness. But soon, the disease began its relentless march up the road from the port and into the main city, and it became clear that this was no act of man, but a pestilence of a terrifying and unknown nature. Thucydides was not just an observer. He caught the disease himself and survived. His account is not one of myth or superstition, but a cold, clinical, and horrifyingly specific description of what the sickness did to the human body. It began, he wrote, with an intense heat in the head. The eyes would become red and inflamed. The inside of the throat and the tongue would turn bloody, and the breath would become unnatural and foul. This was followed by sneezing and hoarseness, and soon after, a harsh cough would seize the victim. When the sickness settled in the chest, it would cause violent stomach upsets and the vomiting of every kind of bile the doctors knew. Most victims would also suffer from painful, ineffective retching and violent spasms. The body, to the touch, was not overly hot, but the skin was reddish, livid, and would break out in small pustules and open ulcers. The internal fever, however, was so unbearable that the afflicted could not stand to wear any clothes or linen. Their only desire was to throw themselves into cold water. Many, in their agony and unquenchable thirst, did just that, plunging into the city's water cisterns, which did nothing to help and only served to contaminate the water for others. This maddening, insatiable thirst was one of the most torturous symptoms. Most of the afflicted died on the 7th or 9th day, consumed by the internal fever. If a person was strong enough to survive this first stage, the disease would then descend into their bowels, causing severe ulceration and a debilitating diarrhea that would often finish them off through sheer exhaustion. The disease, Thucydides noted, seemed to begin at the head and work its way down through the entire body. For the few who survived even this stage, the sickness would leave its cruel mark, attacking their extremities. It would cause them to lose their fingers and toes, and some were even struck blind. Others suffered a complete loss of memory, waking up to find they no longer knew who they were or recognized their own friends and family. In the face of this horror, the people of Athens acted with desperation. Thucydides recorded what happened to his society, and it is a chilling account of how quickly civilization can collapse. The doctors were helpless, and they died in the greatest numbers as they were in constant contact with the sick. Prayers and oracles offered no relief. The gods were silent. The most terrible thing of all, he wrote, was the sheer despair. When a person felt the first symptoms, they would immediately lose all hope, and in giving up, they would hasten their own end. The sacred traditions of burial, so important to the Greeks, were completely abandoned. Athens became filled with the dying and the dead. People were left to perish alone in their homes, and the bodies were often simply left where they fell. The temples, which some had fled to in hopes of divine intervention, became piled high with corpses. The city's laws and sacred rites were ignored. People began throwing their own dead onto the funeral pyres of others, or simply dumping them in mass graves. As the pestilence raged on, a wave of lawlessness swept the city. Thucydides wrote that people, seeing both the good and the wicked dying with equal randomness, lost all fear of the gods and the law. They concluded that piety and honor meant nothing. Since life was so short and uncertain, they decided to live only for immediate, hedonistic pleasure. They began to spend their money wildly and indulge in acts they would have previously kept hidden, believing that they would likely not live long enough to be punished or held accountable for their actions. The great enlightened city, the school of Hellas, had descended into chaos. The plague was a catastrophe from which Athens would never truly recover. It is estimated to have killed a quarter to a third of the entire population, including soldiers, sailors, and its great leader, Pericles himself. This devastating loss of manpower and the complete collapse of public morale were a major turning point in the war, a wound from which Athens would ultimately bleed out, leading to its final defeat at the hands of Sparta. The fever didn't just kill the people of Athens, it killed the brilliant, optimistic spirit of its golden age. Chapter 6. The Hittite Plague. Our story is now etched not on paper or papyrus, but on tablets of baked clay. We journey to the 14th century BC, to the rugged highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. This was the home of the Hittites, a formidable and often forgotten superpower of the ancient world, a mighty empire that stood as an equal and a rival to the Egypt of the pharaohs. From their fortified capital of Hattusa, they commanded a vast and powerful war machine, their iron chariots the envy of the known world. But for all their military might, they were about to face an enemy that could not be stopped by bronze or iron. For 20 long years, a terrible pestilence ravaged the Hittite lands. It was a plague so enduring and so devastating that it killed 2 successive kings, the great conqueror Suppiluliuma I and his immediate heir. The throne then fell to the younger son, a man named Mursili II, who inherited not a thriving empire, but a kingdom in the grip of a 2-decade-long nightmare. What makes this plague so unique is how we know of it. Our guide is not a detached historian, but the terrified king himself. In a series of clay tablets known as the Plague Prayers, King Mursili left behind a desperate, emotional record of his attempt to understand and stop the suffering of his people. For the Hittites, a plague was never a random act of nature. It was a direct and deliberate punishment from the gods for a specific sin committed by mortals. And so, Mursili began a divine investigation. He wrote in his prayers to the great storm god of Hatti, "What is this, O gods? For 20 years now, people have been dying in my land. I cannot endure the anguish of my heart. I cannot endure the sickness of my soul." He consulted his oracles, asking them again and again the same desperate question. Well, what did we do wrong? Finally, the oracles gave him an answer. The sin was not his, but his father's. Years earlier, the great king Suppiluliuma had broken a sacred treaty with the Egyptians, attacking their territory in a border dispute. During this conflict, the Hittites took many Egyptian prisoners and brought them back to their homeland. But these prisoners carried with them an invisible disease, the one that would become the Great Hittite Plague. The king's sin of breaking an oath had brought a divine curse upon his people. The Hittite texts do not describe the sickness with the clinical precision of the Greeks. They speak not of symptoms, but of impact. The prayers tell us simply that the land of Hatti is ill, and that the plague was so thorough that even the temple priests and the bakers who made the sacred bread for the gods had all died. leaving no one to perform the holy rites. Based on the region and the descriptions, modern scholars believe the disease may have been tularemia, or rabbit fever. If so, the Hittites would have experienced a sudden high fever, chills, and exhaustion. Painful ulcers would have appeared on their skin, and their lymph nodes would have swollen, much like the buboes of the bubonic plague. For many, it would have progressed to a fatal pneumonia. It was a swift, debilitating, and terrifying disease. Faced with this divine wrath, Morsili and his people did not turn to medicine. They turned to ritual. Having identified the sin, the king began a desperate campaign of atonement, a series of bargains with his angry gods. In his prayers, you can hear the voice of a desperate man trying to reason with an unstoppable force. He admits his father's guilt, saying, "It is true, my father sinned." But he pleads with the gods, "Now the sins of the father have fallen upon the son. Punish me, but let my people live. Let the plague be driven from my land." The Hittites performed elaborate rituals to purify the land and appease the gods. One of the most powerful of these was the ritual of the scapegoat. The priests would take a ram and adorn it with green ribbons. They would then lead it before the king, who would lay his hands upon it, symbolically transferring the sins of the land, the broken treaty, and the plague itself onto the animal. This ram, now carrying the weight of the nation's guilt, would be driven out into the wilderness, towards the enemy's land, in the desperate hope that it would carry the pestilence away with it. We do not know if these rituals worked, or if the plague simply burned itself out over time. But we do know the cost. The 2-decade-long pestilence crippled the Hittite Empire. It devastated the population, killed 2 kings, and severely weakened its formidable army. While the empire would survive for another century, it was a shadow of its former self, left vulnerable to its rising enemies like the Assyrians. This great plague was the beginning of the end for the Hittite civilization, a long twilight from which they would never fully recover. The Hittite plague offers us a rare and precious glimpse into the ancient mind. While other plagues were recorded by historians, this one was recorded by a king in his own words, in the form of a prayer. It is a story not of science or medicine, but of sin, guilt, and a desperate search for meaning in a world of suffering. It is the sound of a great empire on its knees, begging its gods for forgiveness. Chapter 7. The Living Death. Not all plagues in history arrived like a thunderclap. Some did not sweep through cities in a matter of weeks, leaving silence in their wake. Some were far more patient. They were a slow, creeping decay, a disease that would take not just your life, but your identity, your family, your very place in the world, long before your final breath. Of all the sicknesses that have haunted humanity, none inspired a terror quite like the one they called the living death, leprosy. Its roots are ancient, with descriptions of a similar skin disease appearing in the oldest texts of India, China, and Egypt. It was a constant, simmering fear in the background of the ancient world. But its power came not just from its physical effects, but from the profound social and spiritual meaning that people attached to it. The disease itself, now known as Hansen's disease, is caused by a remarkably slow-growing bacterium. Unlike the explosive plagues, its onset is subtle. Its primary target is not the skin, but the nerves. It begins by deadening the body's ability to feel pain, temperature, and touch, especially in the hands, feet, and face. It is this single cruel symptom that leads to the disease's most infamous disfigurements. A person with leprosy can burn their hand and not feel it, can get a cut on their foot and not know it. Over years, these repeated, unfelt injuries and subsequent infections cause the gradual loss of fingers, toes, and the collapse of facial features. The disease doesn't make parts of the body fall off. It simply takes away the pain that warns us to protect ourselves. This slow outward decay of the body was terrifying to ancient peoples. They saw it as a physical manifestation of an inner corruption, a divine punishment for some terrible, hidden sin. It was this belief, especially in medieval Europe, that led to the disease's greatest horror, the social death. When a person was diagnosed with leprosy, they were often forced to undergo a horrifying ceremony known as the leper's mass. The afflicted person would be brought to the church, dressed in a funeral shroud, and made to stand in an open grave dug in the nave. The priest would conduct a full funeral mass for them, declaring them legally and spiritually dead to the world. They were given a final blessing and then cast out of the community forever, a living ghost, forbidden from ever returning. From that moment on, they were a true outcast. They had to live in isolated communities known as leper colonies, or simply wander the countryside, surviving on charity. They were often forced to wear special identifying clothing and to carry a wooden clapper or a bell. This was the leper's bell, a constant rattling announcement of their presence, a warning to all healthy people to stay away, to clear the path. They were forbidden to touch anyone, to speak unless spoken to, or to drink from a public well. They were watching their own bodies slowly decay, while being utterly and completely alone. It was a fate many considered worse than the swift death of the Black Plague. This reign of fear and stigma lasted for centuries. But even in the darkest times, there were moments of profound compassion. In the 19th century, a Belgian priest named Father Damien traveled to the notorious leper colony on the island of Molokai in Hawaii. He went to serve the forgotten outcasts, and he chose to live among them not as a priest, but as one of them. He embraced them, ate with them, and treated their sores. He brought dignity and hope to a place that had none. After 12 years, he contracted the disease himself and eventually died among the people he had served. His story became a powerful symbol of compassion, finally challenging the ancient stigma. It was only in the 20th century that science finally caught up to the disease, with the development of multi-drug therapies that could completely halt its progression and cure it. We now know that leprosy is not a divine curse, and is in fact extremely difficult to transmit. The ancient terror was built on a profound misunderstanding. And so, we conclude our journey through the great sicknesses of the past. We have seen empires brought to ruin by the invisible bacterium of plague. We have witnessed continents hollowed out by the ancient virus of smallpox. We have walked through industrial cities choked by the blue death of cholera. And we have sat with the lonely outcasts of leprosy. These stories are a testament to the fragility of human civilization, a reminder that our greatest cities and most powerful rulers are always at the mercy of the unseen world. They show us the terror of the unknown and the desperate search for meaning, whether through prayer or through science. But above all, they are a story of resilience. For after every great dying, humanity, though scarred and changed, endured. We learned, we built sewers, we created vaccines, we found cures. The great shadows that haunted our ancestors have, for the most part, been banished. They now exist as whispers in our history books, chilling tales to be told in the safety of a world that has, through great suffering, finally learned their lessons. And now, free from those ancient fears, you too can rest.